Bulge. My name's Tom Hewlett. I think maybe most of you know who I am. Obviously, we're going to be here for about an hour and a half. And you know, you can't really do the Battle of Bulge in an hour and a half. But we're going to get a snippet of it. We have a gentleman here from the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle Barracks, Robert Mages. Robert is, among other things, he is the chief of oral history, the oral history branch there. And Robert has agreed, and we appreciate his help here today, to provide an overview of the Battle of Bulge, kind of the strategic discussion of the Battle of Bulge. We were talking with him at lunch. I think it's going to be very interesting. Then we have Mitch Cady. Is Mitch here yet?
I can't find it, Tom.
Okay.
Search everywhere in this.
All right. Well, we think we're going to have Mitch Cady.
I'll make another run.
And Mitch is going to talk about the 87's involvement in the Bulge. And then we have some veterans here that we hope will, as much as they want to, share their experiences with us during that period of time. And I would invite all of you, as they are talking, and if you have questions, and time permitting, to ask your questions of them. And then Bob, I'm calling Bob, since we've gotten to know each other a little bit here, we're going to, if you have questions for him, and I hope you do, we're going to take a few, and we're just going to see how our time goes along here this afternoon, okay? So with that, oh, let me tell you something else. There's Mitch.
There's Mitch.
This movie you were just watching, I don't know if it's familiar to you at all, but this movie was produced by public television and aired in 1995 at the 50th anniversary of World War II. It's about 90 minutes long, very well done. I think some of you know that my father was in I-347. My father passed away when he was 30 years old. My grandparents never felt he was well after coming back from World War II. Spent the last couple of years of his life in and out of the VA hospital in Indianapolis. But he happens to be in this chow line photograph. And I was telling somebody earlier today, I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but the first time I saw this photograph, I learned about it, and I had a couple of photocopies of it that weren't very good. With, you know, some of you veterans sent them to me and, you know, circled his head on a photocopy and said, "Your dad," and that sort of thing. And I had a man that worked for me who paid more attention to public television than I do, and said, "Oh, by the way, we've been talking about these things." And he said, and this is in 1998, he said, "Oh, by the way, the public television is going to run this program on the Battle of Bulge." So I'd never seen it, didn't know what was in it. But by this time I was aware of this photograph, but hadn't seen a real copy of it. My kids are in college, they're gone, my wife's gone someplace. I'm sitting home by myself watching this 90-minute program. And at the end of this program, to my surprise, was this photograph. And they zeroed in my father's face. So it was pretty touching for me. So they produced this in VHS format, but now they put it into a DVD form. You can get it on PBS website if you're interested. I don't get any anything for selling this thing. So with that,
What's the title?
it is called Battle of the Bulge, the Deadliest Battle of World War II, and it's narrated by David McCullough. So with that, Bob, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, and thanks so much for being here.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Golden Acorns. On behalf
my director, Dr. Conrad Crane, and my commander, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Viney, I want to thank you all for inviting the Army Heritage Education Center to participate in your reunion. Yes, sir.
A little louder.
Little louder? Oh, okay. Okay, I was a young sergeant once. I can do that too. All right, well, I know it's traditional when you give a speech to start off with a joke, but it's been my experience that when I do, either I get no laughs or I bring down the house and then get a letter of reprimand and have to spend a week in sensitivity training. So I'm going to skip that well-worn tradition. I'm just going to get right into it here. I was asked to provide a strategic overview of the Battle of the Bulge, and I was approached actually by our education service, who does our veterans outreach, and they're spread a little thin these days, and I am the World War II, Cold War, one of the World War II, Cold War historians in the building, and I got me to scratch my head a little bit. How do you do a strategic overview in 20 minutes? What I want to do today is just kind of cover the big pieces for you and kind of set the table, talk a little bit about what the Battle of the Bulge means to us today, talk a little bit about what it meant at the time, describe for you in general detail what the context of the battle was within the larger fight in Northwest Europe, and then hopefully take your questions as they relate to the campaign. I would be remiss if I didn't begin by talking a little bit about the Army Heritage and Education Center. And I know that a number of members of your association have visited us in Carlisle. Did anyone hear that was there that came to see us? Okay, great stuff. Oh, pretty good. Pretty good slides. All right. Very quickly, we are the Army's premier archive. We are the only site of memory that the Army currently has. We are one of the world's largest repositories of soldier letters, diaries, photographs, memoirs, personal anecdote, personal items, and so on. We basically are the repository for all of the unofficial papers that soldiers save and generate. And our purpose is to collect these items and add them to our collection, preserve them, and then, most importantly, make them available for study. We have scholars from all over the world come visit our archive, and these scholars write the histories that you find on the shelves at Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. And any given day, you can come into our reading room and see people like Rick Atkinson and people like John Keegan and Andrew Roberts and all of these Pulitzer Award-winning historians that have made their reputation largely by using our holdings. And of course, the good news is it's all free. When I say free, I mean you already paid for it with your tax dollars. So it's just a matter of coming into our archive and actually using the material. And I would say to the veterans in the audience and even the family members, if you're looking for a place for your final place to deposit your letters and your diaries and your photographs or any other items that you may have collected, consider the Army Heritage and Education Center. And consider it for two reasons. First, we have a highly trained staff of archivists and conservationists, both paper and material, and they will take the very best care of your artifacts that can be afforded. And secondly, and most importantly, your artifacts will live on for as long as there is an Army. They will be there forever, and they will be available forever. And your story will be preserved and shared with generations of soldiers, scholars, and citizens. Okay. All right, Battle of the Bulge. Probably one of the most iconic campaigns in American military history. And by iconic, I mean it is a battle that is known to all, and it is so freighted with visions and with stories of sacrifice and valor and perseverance and recovery. Every soldier in the Army knows about it. Every soldier in the Army learns about it. The campaign ribbon that you see on your division flag, for example, serves forever as a reminder. And that same Ardennes campaign ribbon flies on the division flags of many of the active divisions in our Army, on the 1st Division flag, on the 101st Division flag, on the 82nd Division flag. And there are many soldiers in the Army today who, on their left shoulder, wear the Presidential Unit Citations and the Foreign Military Service Awards that were won by the soldiers in the Bulge, that are now worn by our soldiers in memory of those men, and to remind them of the sacrifices that were made and the legacy that they have inherited as a part of their units. In practical terms, it comes to us as the last desperate throw of the dice for a dying dictatorship. It's important to remember here that this was Hitler's last throw, his last attempt to try and change the metrics on the ground and try and salvage some kind of victory from his debacle of the Western Front. It also signaled, in many ways, the real ascendance of the American Army. The British allies were really beginning to fade at this point. Their manpower reserves had almost reached an end. The American Army demonstrated at the end of the Battle of the Bulge that not only were they a mature, highly capable force, but they were also a pretty doggone lethal one as well. And they were able to recover from shocks very quickly and able to inflict some pretty damaging losses on what was, before then, the German army, which was probably the finest fighting force in the world at that time. And most importantly, and I think something that often gets lost, it was probably one of the most singular American victories of the war. And in a very real sense, it helped bring the war to an end in Western Europe. All right, let's start with reviewing the situation here. And I like to kind of phrase this in kind of good news, bad news. I want to start first with the Western Allies, and again, referring to the period of fall and winter of 1944. Now, for the Allies, this is mostly good news. They had just executed the most complex, difficult, and monumentous military operation in human history. I'm talking, of course, about D-Day. They had established 3 army groups on the continent of Europe in less than 2 months. They had liberated Paris ahead of schedule. They had pushed the German army back to the frontiers of the Reich, and in the process, they had destroyed 2 full German army groups composed of some of the best troops in the German army. Again, this is a point that's often missed. Remember at the Falaise Gap in July and August, 2 German panzer armies were destroyed, among them some of the best troops that the Germans had. Now, this was a pretty major fill-up for the American army and for the Allies, because they had demonstrated that they were quite capable of facing the Germans in the field and inflicting pretty significant damage upon them. The Allies had also established strategic depth by taking most of France and Belgium. What did this mean? Well, we could finally open up all those wonderful fighter fields that were in France and provide really in-depth fighter coverage for our bomber streams as they penetrated deeper into Europe. We also were able to stage our medium bombers further forward and push our interdiction window forward. So we were able to grab strategic depth by seizing these places. And we also made it pretty clear that the Allies were here to stay. We weren't going anywhere. The Germans had lost their opportunity to push the Allies off the continent of Europe. The Allies were there to stay, and the decision was going to be made, the decision was going to be achieved somewhere on German soil. The Royal Navy and the United States Navy now ruled the seas, both in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, so our strategic supply lines had been absolutely assured in a concrete way. The German Navy had ceased to be a factor in the North Atlantic in May of 1943. The best way for their U-boats to commit suicide was to fire a torpedo at one of our convoys. And the German U-boat skippers knew this, and when they went to sea, the first thing they did was find a nice sandy bottom to hide on. So our supply lines were secure. We had also begun to open the channel ports that we had seized. Now, not all of them were open. There were still German garrisons that were holding a number of these seaports, both in Holland, in Belgium, and in Brittany. But many of them had been seized, and we'd already recovered from the damage that the Germans had done, and we were able to start bringing supplies into these ports as opposed to beaches. So the supply situation was looking up as well. Finally, and maybe most importantly, the Allies had demonstrated that they had an overwhelming material superiority over the Germans. Even if they weren't able to get all of those supplies into Europe over the beach, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that the Allies had the means to absolutely bury the Germans in the Western Front. The Allies knew it, and the Germans knew it too. Now the bad news, and there was some bad news. We had spent 6 months prior to D-Day absolutely pulverizing the French rail and road network. Not thinking, of course, that we might need that rail and road network later as we advance forward into Germany. Now, that caused some problems for us because as our forces advanced, we were not able to keep the logistical supply line behind them to move forward all the fuel and bullets and black oil and beans that the soldiers would need at the front. Now, this created some real problems for the Allies because they weren't able to maintain the operational pace to actually pursue the Germans. So in short, the Germans were able to withdraw faster than the Allies were able to advance, and this did cause some problems. The Allies also found that German resistance was beginning to stiffen. As the Germans recovered from their initial shock of losing those 2 army groups, as they withdrew back towards their own frontier, they had the benefit of withdrawing on their own lines of communication. So their supply lines were shortened. They were also withdrawing into terrain that was a lot easier to defend. Withdrawing across the plains of open France, they were now closing in on the mountainous and wooded terrain on the Franco-German border, easier to defend, and they're able to fall in on a lot of the bunkers on the Siegfried line that they built in 1940 that allowed them to build a static defense. So the resistance was beginning to stiffen, and the Allies knew it. Campaign season was closing. All those open skies of summer had yielded to some pretty nasty weather in fall and winter. What that meant was Allied air power was becoming less of a factor, and bad weather, of course, means bad roads, which complicated and made it more difficult the Allies' logistical situation. And finally, in that fall, the Allies had begun to experience, for the first time, some real tactical and operational setbacks. You may have heard of Operation Market Garden, for example. We all heard of Operation Market Garden. It was an attempt by the First Allied Airborne Army to seize bridges over rivers in Holland to get Montgomery's army group across the Rhine and to seize the Ruhr. Well, we're not here to talk about that battle, but suffice it to say it failed very badly. The Allies lost. Essentially, the British 1st Airborne Division was almost completely annihilated. The U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions took significant losses, and the Allies were really pretty badly humiliated and were prevented from crossing the Rhine. The Americans had their reverses as well. We all heard of the Herdingen Forest. The Americans were attempting to push through some of the mountain and wooded terrain south of Aachen, got themselves in a pretty nasty meat grinder. We lost a couple pretty good divisions trying to chew through there. What this meant to the Allies was they realized that the days of easy victories were now over. German resistance had stiffened. They had been able to reestablish their defense, and the days of running across the open plains of France were done. From now on, it was going to be a grind. But the Allies felt, good news, we've got what it takes to grind it out with the Germans. We've established ourselves on the continent. We think we're better than they are. We've got more stuff than they've got. We think our people are better than they are, and we're going to win this thing. Now, on the German side, mostly bad news, as you can imagine. The Germans had long ago lost the initiative, but now they had lost even the operational initiative on all fronts. What that meant was the German army was no longer capable of mounting large-scale counterattacks or any attacks of any kind in 1944. The Soviets and the Western Allies had now established themselves on German soil. This is significant. This is the first time since the 1800s that an enemy had actually stood with his feet on German soil. And this was pretty traumatic to the Germans. What this meant in practical terms is that the Allies are now within striking distance, real striking distance of major German population centers, economic centers, and industrial centers. The German Luftwaffe, the vaunted air weapon that had ruled the skies in 1940, was now a shadow of its former self. Yes, they had some pretty good pilots still and some pretty good units, but what little they had left had to intercept the bomber streams that were flying overhead every day, and very little was left to provide tactical support. In fact, there was a joke that German soldiers used to tell on the Western Front. They'd look up in the sky and they'd say, if that airplane is painted camouflage, it's British. If it's silver, it's American. If it's invisible, it's German. So they hadn't seen their Luftwaffe for quite a long time, and that was pretty traumatic. The German army had suffered horrible losses in 1944, what I would call catastrophic. And by catastrophic, I mean they could not recover from them. They lost an army group in Russia, Army Group Center, as a function of Operation Bagration in June. Probably the most powerful army group in the German army, destroyed in a matter of weeks. And they had lost two army groups in France, Army Group B and Army Group G. Now, these losses were just unsustainable. They could never rebuild many of these units. And this was quite a question below to their ground strength. Their industries and their cities were being pounded day and night by Allied air power. This was beginning to have an effect. Not only did it destroy their factories, but it dehoused their population. In other words, it created a refugee problem for the Germans. We talked about the refugee problem in World War II. It actually started well before the end of the war. The Germans had a huge problem with housing and feeding the populations of their major industrial cities in the Ruhr, for example, in Hamburg and elsewhere, that had been housed as a result of Allied bombing. This had an effect. Their former allies were defecting or had been defeated. Now, not only did defecting allies turn their army against the Germans, they also denied the Germans significant raw materials. The oil of Romania, for example, or the bauxite and the iron ores from Sweden, and all these other vital strategic minerals that they had grabbed in the Balkans were now denied to them. And finally, and this is also significantly important, Adolf Hitler had completely lost all confidence in his professional military advisors. He had not lost confidence in his army. He had not lost confidence in his soldiers. He had not lost confidence in his competent junior leaders, but he no longer believed in his generals. He thought they had all become defeatists. He thought they were all either incompetent intentionally or were deliberately sabotaging his orders. This would figure in later. Now the good news, and there was some, the fronts by that December had stabilized temporarily. By stabilized, I mean both the Allies and the Russians had culminated their attacks, which in technical terms, less technical terms, mean they'd outrun their supply lines. They had to stop, at least temporarily, to reconstitute their units. Hitler knew this, even if his generals did not. So there was a breathing space that they were going to be afforded. The German army remained under arms in the field and capable. Yes, they had suffered terrible losses. Yes, they had suffered unrecoverable losses. Nevertheless, they were still in the field and they were still fighting. Their units were still cohesive. Their soldiers still believed in their leader, and many of their junior leaders were very, very competent and suffered in the 5 long years of the Hard School of War, and they were very, very good. And there were still enough of them to make an impact. The German war economy had actually achieved levels of production in 1944 that they had not achieved prior. Because prior to that, believe it or not, the Nazi state refused to go to a total war footing. Women still stayed at home and kept the households together. The Germans were still making commercial products for their people. They were still doing rather silly things in industry because the Germans were very reluctant to declare total war. Well, that stopped in 43 and 44. Joseph Goebbels and Albert Speer were finally able to get the German economy on a war footing, and their production had actually increased. They were making hundreds of thousands of armored fighting vehicles and airplanes, and many of these were of the highest quality. They had already advanced into a next generation of weapons, fighter jets, rockets, some of the finest tanks that had ever been seen. These were coming off German assembly lines. They were very good, there were a lot of them, and they were ready to go. And finally, and again, most importantly, Hitler's spell had not been broken. Hitler was still the Führer of the National Socialist state. People were still willing to follow him. More importantly, his army was willing to follow him, and they were still willing to follow him to the end. Okay, the Allied plan. The goal of the Allies had been pretty well documented and stated since the Casablanca Conference in 1943, and that was unconditional surrender. The Allies were determined to completely destroy the National Socialist state, root and branch. Now, if you think about that, what that means is the Allies were determined to carry the war to the soil of Germany itself, to kick in the door of the Reich Chancellery, stand on Hitler's desk if he was still there, and dictate peace terms. Now, that's significant. The Germans knew it. This was going to end badly for them. In the east, the Red Army had decided they wanted to achieve the Elbe River by spring. The Elbe River is the river that kind of defines eastern Prussia. They figured they'd get there, rest, try and get some bridgeheads across, and launch a drive towards Berlin in the springtime. For the Western Allies, a similar approach. Eisenhower decided pretty early on in the fall that he was not going to give the enemy, the Germans, any respite whatsoever. Now, there were some in Eisenhower's camp that thought the best thing to do would be to have a strategic halt for a while and repair the railroads and the roads behind them and start bringing supplies forward, start creating the dumps that they need, start bringing more replacements in, and take these new divisions that were arriving and give them a chance to get climatized, put them through a local training regime, and get them ready to go. Ike said no. I said no. He said, we are going to push the Germans every day and every hour in every single front. And his reasoning is simple. He said, yeah, okay, we may be short of supplies, but we still are better supplied than they are. Yeah, all right, we may be spread pretty thinly, but we're not nearly as spread as thin as they are. And yeah, okay, the weather stinks. Well, the weather stinks for them too. And every day that we wait is a day we're going to pay for later, because Eisenhower realized one fundamental military principle, as repeated over and over at every level nothing good comes from a break in contact with the enemy. Once you've got him by the lapels, the best thing to do is keep a hold of him and keep hitting him, and one of you falls down. Ike was determined to fight the war that way. Now that had some serious repercussions at the tactical level, and I'll get to that a little later. Did not believe we should be consolidating ground. Now what does that mean? Very simply, Eisenhower believed that if you take a position and advance that can be used later to continue the attack, you will hold it, even if that entails great tactical risk. Eisenhower wanted to cross the Rhine, take the Ruhr, and drive on Berlin as his final objective. The Germans anticipated these almost to a T. Can everybody read that? Okay. Well, the Germans anticipated these moves. They knew exactly what the Allies were going to do. And they were not surprised by anything that Eisenhower had done up to that time. Now, the German plan. Now, before I get into this too much, I want to talk a little bit about something that's very important and often gets lost in history of World War II. And that is something called the Führer principle. And I just want to make a word on military decision-making in the Nazi state. National Socialism was not a rational ethos. It was an odd mixture of social paternalism, xenophobia, chauvinistic ultranationalism, and murderous racism. Indeed, there are many scholars who would argue that it wasn't even an ideology, it was more of a personality cult. And there is truth in this. It's impossible to conceptualize National Socialism without understanding the personality of Adolf Hitler. And the tenet of National Socialist ideology that had the greatest impact on military decision-making was something called the Führer principle, or the leadership principle. And the leadership principle held that the will and the word of the Führer was paramount and absolute in all cases. It overrode any written law. It overrode any conflicting opinion. It overrode economic and political and physical reality. What the Führer said was truth. What the Führer believed was the way it was going to be. And Hitler imposed the Führer principle over and over in every facet of German society. At the start of World War II, Hitler declared to the German nation, quote, "I am asking no German man more than I myself was ready to perform during the 4 years of World War I. I am from now on nothing more than the first soldier of the Reich. I have once more put on the coat that was most sacred and dear to me. I will not take it off again until victory is assured, or I will not survive the outcome." Prophetic indeed. These are not empty words. Hitler began consolidating his absolute power over the German military rule before the start of the war. By his ascension to the German presidency in 1934, he became the titular chief of the German armed forces, and in 1938 he created his own headquarters called Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW. He invested himself in supreme operational authority over the German military machine. And he did not feel in any way bound to follow any military precepts. He did not feel in any way bound to follow the professional military advice of his classically trained graduates of the Kriegsacademy. Hitler believed that he knew better and it was going to be done his way. In the words of historian John Keegan, quote, "Hitler was, in a sense, an anti-clerical in the Church of War, a devotee of its practices, but a root and branch critic of its high priests. He had witnessed at first hand the bloody outcome of their rituals, the taking of omens, the dedication of victims, the performance of sacrifice, and he had seen that the God of victory was not satiated. He was, in consequence, to give high priests very short shrift. Hitler had decided that he was going to seek a decision in the West, often against the opinions of his professional military advisors. Now, some practical considerations were, of course, that the West was the traditional first enemy of the German people and the German Reich since the days of Rome. It was the closest route to all their major industrial areas and was the closest route to many of their major population centers as well. And of course, the Western allies at that time were, in many ways, the closest and most dangerous foe. The Russians were very numerous on the Eastern Front. They had greater strategic depth. The Allies were not quite as numerous on the ground as the Russians were. They were closer to the German railheads and German supply areas. It would be easier to strike at the Western foes as well. Now, there's some ideological considerations that were even more important to Hitler than the practical ones. First of all, the Nazis had nothing but contempt for the Western democracies. Hitler thought that the Western alliance between the United States and the United Kingdom was an artificial one. He believed that sooner or later, the United States and the United Kingdom would fall out of their alliance and begin fighting over the spoils in Europe and across the globe. And he thought that one good kick, one good shot to that alliance would break it up. And in this, he liked to follow the example of Frederick the Great. And we all heard of Frederick the Great, the Great Prussian king. Right? Frederick the Great was Hitler's role model. Frederick the Great was the great Prussian soldier king who fought in Central Europe against all of the great dynasties of Europe in the mid-18th century. And Frederick's strategy was always to single out one member of the coalitions that were facing him and inflict a humiliating defeat on them and attempt to break up these coalitions. Hitler studied that model closely and was determined to follow it on the Western Front. Okay, now, this is the nub. The Allies expected the German army to react to the moves of the Allies in a rational, professional, sober military manner. In other words, Allied commanders and Allied political leaders thought they were fighting the German General Staff. They forgot or lost sight of the fact that they were actually fighting the Nazi state. And at this point in time, the Nazi state was Adolf Hitler. So they were not fighting Gerd von Rundstedt. They were not fighting General Keitel. They were fighting Adolf Hitler. And Hitler didn't see things quite the same way. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the front. Just to orient you quickly, this is the front line trace here. This is Holland. This is Belgium. This is France. This is Germany. This is the area known as the Ardennes, right here. Now up here is the British 21st Army Group, 1st Canadian Army, 2nd British Army. This is commanded by General Montgomery. This is the 12th Army Group here, right here, commanded by General Omar Bradley. 9th Army to the north, 1st Army in the center, 3rd Army in the south. Now here's the 6th Army Group commanded by General Jacob Devers, which consisted of the American 7th Army and the 1st French Army here. On the German side, well, things are a little bit more confused. Talking about German order of battle at this time is a little difficult because it's a bit of a mash. But start off here with the 1st Parachute Army, and then the real meat of the affair here, which is Army Group B, consists of the 15th Army, the 6th and 5th Panzer Armies, the 7th Army, and the 1st Army, and then a collection of bibs and bobs down here holding outside the Bulge. All right. These were the objectives of the Allies, the industrial centers of Western Germany. The big casino here, which was the Ruhr, and the small one, which was the Saar. Now here we see the no-go terrain. This is the Ardennes and the Eifel. This was characterized by high hills, deep forests, lots of little streams that cut through them, a horrible road network, and a road that led nowhere. Now you see, if you get across all this, you're attacking Germany, where are you going? You're not going anywhere of any significance. This area here was called the Vosges, which is similar to this area up north. This was very mountainous. It was very, very forested. The roads stunk, and again, it's a road to nowhere. So the Allied routes of advance were pretty clear. They had to punch through the Ruhr and the Saar. Again, in war, geography is fate. So this is where the Allies had to go. Right, now, Hitler developed a plan that he called Watch on the Rhine, and he did this in September, quite in isolation from his military chiefs of staff. He was determined that he was going to seek a decision in the West no matter what. So he hatched a plan along with some of his senior military advisors, and he called it Watch on the Rhine, which in German means watch on the Rhine, in order to deceive people into thinking that it was a defensive plan. And his concept was simple and actually pretty brilliant. What he wanted to do was punch through the thinly held sector in the Ardennes with 2 tank armies and 1 infantry army. And his objective was to seize 3 major road networks. The first, Bastogne, here in Belgium. The second, Brussels. And the third, the port of Antwerp. Once these port areas were seized, he wanted to establish a screen along this line here with infantry soldiers, while he sent the rest of his tanks attacking north here into the flanks and rear of the British 21st Army Group. His intention was to drive a wedge between the American Army and the British Army, destroy the British Army, or at least push the British Army back onto the channel ports like they had done in 1940, and either force them to evacuate or destroy them piecemeal. He felt if he could accomplish this, that he would force the Western Allies to come to the table and treat for peace, and then he could turn the rest of his remaining strength on the Russians and try and seek a decision there. Now, the forces available were weighted pretty well in favor of the Germans. You see, they had about 12 plus infantry divisions, 5 armor divisions or panzer divisions, with about 200,000 men, and a good edge of tanks, artillery pieces, and rocket launchers. When I say rocket launchers, most of these were actually what were known at the time as needle rifles or smoke throwers, or basically they were like mortars on steroids. They threw these massive projectiles, but they were very effective. They were easy to make. They were cheap, and the Germans could make a lot of them, and that filled the gap for them because they couldn't build a lot of artillery at the time. Now, the United States had about 4 plus infantry divisions in this sector. It's often been referred to as a nursing home and as a nursery. In other words, Bradley had used this sector, the Bulge, to put units that had suffered terribly, and the Hurtgen let them reconstitute, and also put in newly arrival units so they could spend some time in the front and learn their trade a little bit before they had to commit themselves to an attack. So in this sector, they had about 83,000 men, about 242 medium tanks, Shermans, a pretty good weight of tank destroyers, and a decent weight of artillery. But as you can see, the Germans had a pretty overwhelming superiority. Now, this looks like a really good plan. And when this was first briefed to Hitler's operational commanders, Rundstedt and Model, Model being the Army Group B commander, General Rundstedt being the theater commander, they had 2 reactions. First reaction was, "You got to be out of your mind. This cannot be done. We don't have the resources to do it. We don't have the fuel to do this. This is absolutely impossible." And then they scratched their chins, but you know what? If this was a staff college, that plan's an A. Pretty good plan. But unfortunately not executable. Now, as a final point, and I'm making this point in anticipation of questions that may come later, Hitler insisted on some very strict signal and operational security steps to be taken for this plan. For example, units were forbidden to discuss this plan on the radio. Units were forbidden to discuss this plan in writing. Many of the operational commanders were not brought into this plan until a few months before its execution. Many of the tactical commanders, and I'm talking the regimental and battalion commanders, were not told about this plan until a day before they attacked. So I like to tell people that this plan was, the Battle of the Bulge was almost as big a surprise to the German army as it was to the American one. So there were reasons why it was difficult for the Allies to sniff out what the Germans were up to. All right, I want to take you quickly through the actual prosecution of the battle. I want to caveat this because I know we're running out of time. I just want to caveat this by something that was once said by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. When he was asked to describe the Battle of Waterloo, he would often turn up his nose, make a sour face, and say, "You might as well ask me to describe the history of a dance ball. I don't know. I saw the little piece I saw. I think I know what cause and effect was there. All I know is there was a big scrap and we won." Well, it's often that way in military history. We like to cut things up into nice little neat packages to study and to analyze and draw lessons from. But history, life's not that neat. History's not that neat, and certainly battles aren't that neat as well. So what I'm going to step through is just kind of the major pieces of it. We get a few things a little fudgy, understand that, this is just for the purposes of an overarching discussion. So in other words, sharpshoot all you want, but understand it's going to end the same way no matter what. So, all right, the breakthrough. Initially, things went very well. The German army was able to collapse on the 2 divisions that were holding the center of the Bulge. The first was the 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, which is a drafty division that had just recently arrived into the front. And the other was the 28th Division, the Keystone, or the Bloody Bucket, as the Germans called them, which was a Pennsylvania National Guard division that had received a levy of draftees and had actually fought very well prior to that, but had gotten a terrible beating in the Hurtgen Forest. They had been sent to the center as well. Well, things ended very badly for both those units as they bore the brunt of the fighting. The 106th Division occupied some very difficult positions forward of some thin rivers in the Schnee Eifel. Remember we talked about before, Eisenhower would not countenance withdraws from areas that can be used for counterattacks. As a consequence, 2 regiments of the 106th Division were cut off and were forced to surrender. A pretty humiliating outcome for the American Army. The 28th Division just was completely annihilated in a 2 days fight. So the Germans were able to get a breakthrough. But things began going wrong almost immediately. The Germans had not anticipated the difficulty of moving 30-ton tanks through that kind of terrain. Now, we all know they'd done it in May 1940. Great stuff. This wasn't May 1940 anymore, and it wasn't May. This was December. It was raining. It was cold. The roads had been torn up. Many of the bridges were down, and the Germans weren't running through this with Mark II Panthers anymore. These were big Mark V Tigers, or Mark VI Tigers, and Mark V Panthers. Awfully difficult to maneuver these tanks that were designed to fight in the steppes of Russia through these narrow country lanes and over these little streams. So right away they began to run into problems, and their timeline began to suffer. But first things first, they were able to achieve their breakthrough. Now, the classic strategy for defeating a penetration is to pack the shoulders. Don't let the penetration grow any wider. Let them go as deep as they like, but make sure that they don't get any wider in those shoulders so you can pinch them off as they go forward. And that was the first reaction of the Allies. The 7th Armored Division was able to collect up what was left of the 106th Division and form a hedgehog around the town of Saint-Vith. And Eisenhower committed his last reserve, which were the parachute divisions of the 18th Airborne Corps, sending the 101st to the town of Bastogne, that we all know was a major road network, one of the Germans' initial objectives. Now, these positions choked the Germans into this area here and made it more difficult for them to maneuver through the Bulge. And this had a pretty big effect. Now, later on, as the penetration began to expand, the Allies decided the thing to do was just hang on as much as we can. Keep packing these shoulders here. And then they began to bring troops down from the north, around the Aachen area, swing them down, and begin counterattacking the flanks of the Bulge in order to try and choke that shoulder down a little bit more and force the Germans more into that funnel. And they did that over a period of about 4 or 5 days, really culminating on the 26th, when finally counterattacks began to push through, and Bastogne was finally liberated. Well, they don't like to use the word liberated. They get awful soaring. 101st Division Land, you say they were liberated. They prefer to think they were reinforced. Okay. For the 3rd Armored Division, the elements of the 3rd Army, represented by the Golden Acorns, were able to launch an effective counterattack up through the north, reinforce Bastogne, crumble the southern shoulder here, and really put paid to the attack of the 5th Panzer Army, which is actually enjoying the most success and really made it to the Meuse River. Finally, battle was declared won on 2 January when German offensive operations were halted and the Allies were able to completely stop their drive for the Meuse River and begin pushing them back towards the town of Hoffelhuis. Okay, so in conclusion, important to remember that the Battle of the Bulge, Operation Watch on the Rhine, was conceived completely, wholly by Adolf Hitler. It was born in Hitler's imagination. It was driven by Hitler's personality. It was imposed on the German army by Hitler. And in many ways, this whole operation was an expression of Hitler's final will at the end of the war. This was the last in a long line of great German offensives. The last one, it met the American army, and it died a horrible death, their offensive, that is, in those forests. The Germans have failed. It's important to remember. The Germans failed to achieve any of their objectives. Yes, they were able to inflict some pretty significant losses on the American army, but those losses weren't nearly as significant as those suffered by the Germans. And the Americans, thankfully, could recover from them. It was difficult, but we could recover. The Germans could not. The Ardennes was a costly but decisive Allied, I say Allied, I mean American victory. Most, as Churchill would point out, most of the letters of condolences that were generated to families went to American homes and American families. Finally, the Butcher's Bill. The United States suffered 41,315 casualties. That is just in 2 January. The casualties to reduce the Bulge were significantly greater. Lost 4,000 dead, 20,000 wounded, and 16,000 missing. And again, these casualty figures are always a bit squishy. We're never really sure. But this is what the Army says. Casualties were. The Germans, nobody knows. The records were destroyed. All we know is that according to their rail records, The Germans recorded 67,000 casualties as being evacuated. I suspect that number is probably a lot higher. So, what are your questions on the Battle of the Bulge? The strategic context. That was the easy part. Now you get the sharpshooter. Yes, sir.
I have a question. Do you know what percentage of the soldiers there were ASTP?
Did everybody hear that question?
No.
The question was what percentage of the American soldiers on the ground were ASTP? I don't know that off the top of my head. ASTP was a program in which the United States Army was taking soldiers of particular, be careful as I say this, of particular educational intelligence pedigree and grooming them to do advanced technical jobs. What the Army discovered was they needed foot soldiers a lot more than they needed color-headed scientists. So they took these guys and pushed them forward to infantry units and other units. I don't know the answer to that. It was significant. It was significant. Also significant to know that we were also beginning to cannibalize some of our air units and their ground air support units. We're actually putting those guys into the line as well. And they weren't real happy about it, but we need a replacement. Also significant that now we're on this point. Remember, one of the interesting things that fell out of the Battle of the Bulge were we became so short of infantry replacements that for the first time since the 1840s, we were beginning to integrate our units. Black soldiers were being encouraged to serve in white units in white combat camps. So the integration of our Army actually began in 1944 as a direct result of casualties suffered by the Bulge. Thank you for your questions.
I would just make one comment. That is that your title there that the Battle of Bulge was won on January the 2nd. A lot of us who were there would disagree very much. That may have been the final turning point, but there was a hell of a lot of fighting going on long after the
Sure was. And again, as I say, this is the periodization that the Army has come up with. Now, the fighting continued until the Bulge was reduced. What we're saying here, what the Army is saying, and Army official history says, is at this point, the offensive had been stopped. There was no opportunity or no chance that the Germans could continue on.
Use a different term than the battle was won.
We can do that. Yes, sir.
I want to question your 106 division.
Yeah, 106.
I want to question this because the 106 had their Christmas dinner at their home. They came over on the Queen Mary, and they were in the combat zone on New Year's Day. The 87th didn't come to help the 106. The 106 came to help the 87th.
The 106th Division was called the Golden Lions. They were a drafting division by United Mountain Major General Allen. They relieved the 2nd Division, who had fought in that sector for many weeks and had achieved the penetration into the Eifel. Again, Eisenhower didn't like these forests. He was very concerned about these forested areas because he felt that they would serve as springboards for local attacks to pinch out the American salient in Aachen, which was the first German city that we had seized. So Eisenhower was very anxious that these wood lines be occupied in a depth that would allow the Allies observation into them, or at least control the high ground in these forested areas to prevent surprise and any nasty attacks coming out of it. The 106th would lead the 2nd Division in that sector. The 2nd Division was sent north. The 106th was sent there hurriedly, and they really didn't have enough time to actually build an effective defense, and they were really caught in a very unfortunate position.
All right.
Gentlemen, if we could, I'll tell you what, our time is getting short here, and I want to move on to Mitch, okay? Bob, thank you very much. I don't know about the rest of you, but I felt like I got about 2 semesters full here in about 30 minutes. I'm just amazed. Thank you All the sheriffs. I'm glad I don't have to take a test. All right.
I took them all for you, so.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Next, we have Mitch Cady. I think all of you know Mitch, a longtime historian for the association, a celebrated journalist. He's like the Energizer Bunny. He just keeps on going, and he just had an article published. And what newspaper was it?
Well, I'm published locally.
Yeah, so, this guy stays in the game, and we asked him to come and talk about, we're going to drill down a little farther now, and we asked him to talk about the 87's involvement in the Battle of Bulge. So, Mitch Cady.
Thank you. Let me say that even though I was there, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Even though I was there, I don't think I learned anything in a foxhole about the Battle of the Bulge, except that it was brutal and bloody and cold. But what I know now, I learned from 25, 30, 35 books that I've read, and I try to reconcile one version with another version to try to get close to what actually happened to the 87th Division when I was there. I have put a lot of faith in a book by General Troy Middleton. General Middleton was the 8th Corps commander who made some key decisions. One of his decisions was not to allow General McAuliffe to leave Bastogne. General McAuliffe had asked General Middleton if the 101st Airborne could leave Bastogne before the Germans submitted their surrender challenge, which you all remember, and you remember what General McAuliffe's response was, the celebrated nuts. The 101st Airborne should receive a lot of the accolades for the sturdy defense that they put up at Bastogne. On the other hand, when General Middleton was pressed by media representatives to say which units won the Battle of the Bulge, you can be pleased by this. The 87th was one of the three. The 11th Armored was another. And the 17th Airborne, which took a terrible beating, was the third. Now, since General Middleton made all the tactical decisions, not Patton, Middleton made all the tactical decisions. I commend to you reading Middleton's biography. He was a great, great soldier in World War I. He was an officer, but the kind of medals he won, I think, will appeal to every GI here who fought overseas. He was a brigadier general under Patton, and for some reason he got along with Patton. But he did. And it was he who devised unusual tactics that appealed to me as a former infantryman at the time on the scene, that what Middleton reports rings true to me. And here is what he reports about the tactics he used to save Bastogne and ultimately to move toward victory in the Ardennes. What he did was to go against Army doctrine, to break up the armored divisions. That was definitely against Army tactics. And he had studied the maps, so he knew the terrain. He knew where the Germans would have to cross the rivers and the creeks and the bridges. So that's where he sent the task forces, according to his account, to meet the Germans and to try to force them to prevent them from crossing the bridges. Once you started that kind of a backup of tanks and supplies, you can't fight a war unless you keep moving. And the Germans got stuck at key places, he reports, and that was the beginning of the end of the Battle of the Bulge. I could continue, but I'll stop at this point. If you want me to say something about the 87th Division, Middleton passed judgment on us, and he said we were one of the 3 divisions that won the Battle of the Bulge. Thank you very much. Questions? Got any questions? Yes, sir.
What's the name of the book that, about Middleton?
It's called Middleton.
Okay.
A unique name
Okay.
by Frank James Price. Price, P-R-I-C-E. Frank James Price. Yes, sir.
How comes the line, people on line fighting and everything didn't have the equipment to go along with the women? I've heard so many different stories about this and that and that, but you went up there with an overcoat on and a pair of leather shoes and snow up to your knees.
Was the question, why didn't some of the soldiers have proper equipment? Is that the question?
I would like to know the real reason why we didn't have it, because we had everything else, they say, so we didn't have that. The poor guy up in the front never had it. So why? This is what gets
I,
me.
like you, I was in a foxhole, just like you, and I wondered, and I cursed the generals, but why didn't the average GI have adequate clothing and weapons?
Right.
That certainly had to do with the conditions at the time and the Red Ball Express, which was supposed to bring them up and didn't bring up. But if the United States was the arsenal of democracy, which it was, we had more equipment, but I don't think it was better on the whole, especially weapons, than the Germans. My judgment is that the Germans had, we all know, they had that little submachine gun that kept firing all day and never burned out. We had some good weapons, but I'd say on the whole, the Germans had slightly better weapons than the American Army. Is that the consensus here?
Yes.
Disagreements here? Okay.
I agree with you at that point, yes. But to lay out in the snow with an olive red overcoat on is just like somebody shooting at you without a BB gun.
Go ahead, we gotta cut them off.
Okay, sir. John, you want to comment?
I'd like to make a comment. We'd like to agree with what Mitch said, but if you ever read Bob Phillips' book, Crusade by Stone, it was the 110th Regiment of the 28th Division who got beat up in the Arctic Forest, and there were more dead soldiers from the 28th Division outside the perimeter of Bastogne than there were of the 101st Division. Now, a book came out 2 years ago, Dr. John C. McManus, I think he's out in St. Louis University, and the book is Alamo in the Ardennes. It's those small units that got broken up from the initial onslaught of the Germans. They stuck together, they held together, and before the 101st even came on the scene. Those fellows fought in small groups at Baracta Freitura and places like that. A lot of credit should go to them, because if they didn't hold out, the Germans would have been into Brussels or someplace.
Well, that's certainly true. The only thing I know is that Patton and Middleton agreed that the attacks of the 11th Armored Division and the 87th, when Bastogne was practically surrounded, made a huge difference in the ultimate outcome of the Battle of the Bulge.
Thank you very much, All right, we're going to move along. We have 5 gentlemen who agreed to share some of their experiences with us. We're going to ask them to come up and sit here at the table, if you would. We have Hal Moore of the L346. We have Maurice Diamond of the I347 and F347. We have Billy Stegemeyer of H347. We have Lynn Carlin, A312 Medic. And we have Victor Cross, B345. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for agreeing to this. You can move those microphones around. They have there's some flexibility there. I asked them if they would come and just, tell us a little bit about their remembrances of their experience during this period of time, whatever they're willing to share with us. Some of you may feel like you want to ask a question, and maybe at some point, depending on our time, we're going to try to do that. I'd like to just kind of get it started. Maybe we'll start with you, Hal. And I'm not going to ask a lot of questions here, so I really want to open it up to you guys. But I'm kind of curious, somebody you knew, what do you think?
Well, maybe I should qualify that. I was drafted when I was 18, and I was rejected because I only weighed 112 pounds. And they said you had to weigh 126.
Vic, could you maybe speak right in the microphone a little bit closer?
How about that?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay. I only weighed 112 pounds, and then they said I had to weigh 126, and so I was put in 4F, and of course that was devastating for me. And so I thought, well, I'd see what I could do. I went to a naval recruiting station, see if I could enlist, and they said no. I was 4F, I couldn't enlist. So then I went to the Marines, and they wouldn't even talk to me. And then I went to the Coast Guard, and they said no, they couldn't because I was 4F. And I thought about, well, I could join the Merchant Marines. And so then I thought, well, I'll just see what I can do. And so I went to work in Marble Carburetor for a few months, and then I ran across a veteran that was in the South Pacific, and he had severe wounds, and so he was out of the fighting. And I talked to him, and he said, well, you could go volunteer through your draft board. So I went down and volunteered to the draft board, and they said yes. So I just signed a form, and they took a blood test and said they would let me know in about 3 or 4 days. 3 or 4 days went by. I called them up. They said, well, it'll be a while. Maybe 2 or 3 days. So then 3 days later, I went down there. They said, no, it'll be a week. They'd send a telegram. So then I finally got a telegram. And then I was to report where I got on a Greyhound bus, and I lived in Flint, Michigan at the time, and I took my physical down to Detroit. And when I went the first time, they was stamped my papers, my forms, naval, and but I never got any further than that. The second time, I had the same papers. So when I got up there, I had the same guy that turned me down before. And at that time, I gained 2 pounds. So when I went through, he says, well, I'm going to put you in the Army. I said, I don't want to go in the Army. I want to go in the Navy. He said, I can't put you in the Navy. He said, you'd be below decks. It's hot down there. It's hard work. You'd sweat a lot. He said, you're going to be a lot of times that you're not going to be able to see the sun. The seas could be rough. And I don't think you're physically capable of standing that. I'm going to put you in the Army. We can get outdoors, get some fresh air. And he said, build yourself up. And then I said some very unpleasant things. Anyway, then I went directly up to Fort Sheridan, and I spent a week there, and then I went down and took my basic training in Camp Hood, Texas. And I got down in there in July, the end of June. And so I took 16 weeks of infantry training, and then I thought, well, they had different things that come up. I wanted to get into I wanted to become a trooper, but they wouldn't talk to me either, because then I only gained about another 3 pounds when I was in there. I never weighed any more than 123 pounds. In fact, that's what I weighed when I was discharged. And so anyway, I got into anti-tank after the 16 weeks of infantry, and then I qualified as a gunner on a 57 millimeter split drill. And then it was in January. Well, they gave me a week furlough at the end of all that, and that was in December, and then I come back and had to report back to Fort Sheridan, and then they shipped me over to Camp Kilmer, and then I went up to the Boston Harbor, and I got on the Liberty ship. And we left the Boston Harbor and rode a storm all the way over to La Harbe. Even the sailors got sick on that one.
Victor, let me stop you there. Let's move on.
Okay, well, I've got to get over to Europe. So I said I had to get over to Europe. So anyway, then I went up, and so I didn't need any tank gunners. So any tank gunners, and so I was put in the infantry. And the most memorable thing about my first experience was I was on a minesweeping detail out of St. Louis, and we ran across some stuff, and we took turns with this minesweeping unit, and we took a break, and I sat down on a snowbank and heard a noise, a clunk noise, and
Speak just a little louder into the microphone if you can.
And anyway, I reached behind me and I pulled out a mine. I set a mine, but it was one of our mines. I recognized it as one of our mines, and it still had the keeper underneath of the plunger. And then I got digging around, there was a whole case of mines there. But they all had the keeper in there. And then we went on down the road a ways, and we found where some of the artillery dug up some bouncing besties, and we got to look at those firsthand and hold them. And then we went on down, and then we started taking in some incoming mail, some more rockets. You could hear them when they left the tubes. And then Screaming Mimi started coming over. They started coming over, and I was kind of saying some things there, and we were laying in the ditch, and the sergeant said, well, you don't have to worry about them until you stop hearing them. And just like then, he didn't want to say that and stopped. But it lit in the hill about 200 yards up above us. And then as we were laying there, they radioed back to see whether we could get out of there or not, or should we try it. and 3 tanks come up. 2 of them was Shermans and one was an M5. And they sailed on by us, and the last tank, the M5, I couldn't believe it. There was a soldier standing, a tanker standing up out of the open hatch, and the radio was playing. It was playing Glenn Miller music. And it went on by us, and then it was just a matter of a few minutes later, we heard a real loud boom, and then we heard another boom, and then we heard another boom, and then heard something go ooh through the air, and that M5 came back and went by us, and we never did see the other 2 tanks. And then we pulled back and to this where we our point of embarkation there, and then we got on the trucks and went back, and that was my first experience in combat in the Bulge.
Thank you, sir.
I, for one, am very happy that you've gained some weight since then. The question I was asked when I came up here was, how come I enlisted? And I'll tell you as briefly as I can. I was 16 years old in 1943 and was a freshman at Ohio State University in my freshman year. And I was rooming with a family of 3 women, a mother and 2 daughters, and I had room in their house, and I had to provide the labor to put coal in the furnace and take out the garbage, among my other duties. But I had been reading a lot, and history was a passion of mine, and I followed the progress of the war in Europe very closely. And I decided when I was only 16 that Hitler was a tyrant and a menace to the world at large. So on December 6th, we were having breakfast at the home, and the news came over the radio about Pearl Harbor. So I enlisted in the Army in April. And they told me that I was only 16 and a half, and they couldn't allow me to go into active duty, but they would call me up on my birthday, which was in July of 43. And July 1st, I called the 2nd Army Command and said, hey, I'm 18 now, why don't you call me up? And they looked at my records up and they said, we don't have any account of you at all. If you hadn't called us, you'd have probably never gone in at all. So anyway, they called me and I went into active duty on September at Camp Upton, New York. And I had taken the AGCT test, and I had completed 2 years of college by this time. So the personnel officer at Camp Upton said to me, what would you like to do? And this is a typical Army story. I said, I have 2 years of field artillery, ROTC, under my belt. I want to join the field artillery and maybe work my way up to officers candidate school. And he said, we don't need any officers in the field artillery. He said, but he said, with your college training and your AGCT score, we could use you in the ASDP program, and you can study either engineering or foreign languages. By this time, I could speak French passively, and I had studied German in college, and so I said, yeah, that sounds good to me. I'd like to do that. So then he said, okay, but in order to qualify for the ASDP, you have to take basic infantry training. So I went to Fort Benning. The infantry school trained us. I left Fort Benning. I went in September. I left Fort Benning in December, and they sent me to Clemson College, South Carolina, for 3 months, and then they needed the bodies. So a couple of 100,000 of us were thrown into the Army as infantrymen, including a number of Air Corps cadets who were, as the gentleman said, that they were not very happy about it because they weren't really trained in infantry at all. But anyway, that's how I came in. And the reason I enlisted, because I felt that the country needed me. As young and snotty as I was, I thought I could make a difference.
You did.
Well, Tom Langston, we may have a three-star general that wants to come and address you, and we're not sure he's going to make it, but maybe he will. So, this is great. I was only going to ask one question, just to kind of warm you guys up a little bit. Get them all fired up. Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. You keep it coming. And, if you have to leave, if 3 o'clock is your time, that you got to be someplace else, feel free to get up and go. But what I'd like to do, start with you, is just keep going. If the general makes it, fine. If he doesn't make it, and we'll maybe even run a few minutes over, okay? You guys that were drafted, Billy, what was that all about? How did you feel about that?
Well, I graduated from high school in '44 in May, was drafted in June of '44, took 13 weeks of basic training at Camp Wheeler, Georgia, which was a clerk typist at a cook school. The day I got there, they converted it to an infantry training. First day we got to cut grass with our knives out of our mess kits. Didn't have anything for us to do. But anyway, I took the basic training there, which was an infantry training program for 13 weeks. Came home for a week's furlough. Shipped out to Fort Meade, Maryland, POE, and boarded the Queen Elizabeth to go across the pond. Left the 4th of December in '44. And my arrival there was to Glasgow, Scotland. They didn't take the big ships into the channel because of the poison waters. And took a train from Southampton, or from Glasgow, Scotland to Southampton, England. And then we went across on an LCT at Le Havre, France. Stuck us in 40 and 8 boxcars. I'm sure most of you have ridden in those. And we'd go forward a half a day and backwards a half a day until they just were looking for a placement. I was a replacement in the 87. They were looking for blood, warm blood people is what they were looking for as far as infantry. And that's how come I wound up in the H Company of 347. Heavy 30 caliber machine gun.
Hallelujah.
The question was, how old were you?
I was 18 years old, and I celebrated my 18th birthday, December the 25th, in the Bulge.
What was it like for you when you got that call?
Well, I intended to join the Navy, but my mother prevailed on me to put it off a little bit, and by that time the Army had drafted me. So, I ended up training, going through all the training, joined the 87th, and we shipped across the ocean on the Queen Elizabeth. And landed in Glasgow, stopped for a time in a place called Knutsford, England. And then we went across the Havre, and we got on the 40 and 8. And I remember I spent my 19th birthday shipping across France, the 3 days that it took the boxcar to get to the Metz area, where we started fighting in some towns called Obergeelbach, Niedergeelbach, and there was another one I know, but I've forgotten now. And we were there a couple of weeks, I guess, and we shipped up to Reims on our way to the Bulge, in the open trucks. And my experience in Reims was getting a cup of coffee from the Red Cross, which they wouldn't give me unless I paid for it, the coffee and donuts. So that made me kind of sore at the Red Cross for quite a while. But I did get one because someone let me have a coin to buy the coffee and donut. And we went to the Battle of the Bulge. I got transferred from my company to F company at that time. And continued from there, I guess.
Can you tell us about how you found yourself in the Army?
Well, I was drafted. I was drafted in April of '43.
Just put it.
I was drafted in April of '43, 19 years old. Took the basic training in Fort Knox. And after basic training, they said they put me in Cook and Baker School, and that was enjoyable. Then I got in a heavy tank, experimental tank unit, because I wanted out the fresh air, being an old farm boy. And that was being disbanded, and so at that point they shipped me and I don't know how many others to the 87th down in Fort Jackson, South Carolina. I guess that's preparation getting up to personnel level. They needed to go over on the Queen Elizabeth in October. And we landed in Glasgow. And from there we spent some time, and then we went over to France. That was probably early December. And when I got there, then's when things were getting kind of rough. We landed, got off the boat, rain, mud, marched up the hill to the apple orchard for our bivouac before we went on into action. And the rain and mud continued all the way up through there. And I remember the first day being wet, rain, artillery is going one way, going the other way. I was on the ground, on my butt, more than I was on my feet. And somehow I got disoriented that night. I found me a dry place to sleep and warm. Luckily, I was able to get back to the unit, stay with them until we got out further into Germany. And at that point, I guess I got the order to transfer us up to, ship us up to the Bulge. Got on these big trucks. And that was on Christmas Eve. And we rode all night. And come time for dinner, pulled off the road. And had a Christmas dinner, hot meal, with most all the trimmings. I don't know. The cooks prepared this in the field ranges on the trucks on the way up. That is a task in itself, having worked with field ranges. And as we was eating the dinner, the sky was white with vapor trails. It was the first day, one of the first days I was able to get up in the air and fly. Then we went on up into where the battle area was. And while we were there, we began to gain these ASTP replacements. Those boys come in, they didn't have the proper clothing on, warm clothing. Some of them hadn't had adequate training on their rifle, and you just wondered what was going on. And it was cold, 0 weather, there's getting snow on the ground, And then on the 8th of January, at 3 o'clock in the morning, I was given the mission to go down into a field, go through a field and cut some barbed wire fences in preparation for the rest of the troops to make an attack. After I got my mission completed, I was looking around because things didn't look just the way I understood they would be. At that point, I got shot, took a bullet on my lower leg, and hand grenade shrapnel in the body. Snow was about 2 foot deep. So the only thing I could do was I had to get down and figure out what I was going to do. So I was able to go through the snow just like a mole over to the road and get back up to the command post, which is about a quarter of a mile away. I wasn't wounded that bad, but I couldn't navigate. And from there, they sent me on to the hospital for 3 months. So I missed the major battles around Tulare. And I say major battles, I am told by various ones of hand-to-hand combat. There was troops cornered in a house with an 88 barrel pointing it down at them. And some of them survived that, got out of it. And then there was another major battle, which they called Bloody Crossroads. Crossroads indicating there was a major transportation artery. And I'm told at that battle, there was a small stream they had to cross. Some of it was waist deep. This was in January. Still zero weather and snow and everything. So I was fortunate. I was lucky. Even though all the rain, snow, and mud, there was nothing to what the old soldiers went through. So after 3 months, I come back to the continent. By that time, the division had come back to the States, so I spent the rest of the time in the occupation forces. Opening 3 missiles in one day, opening an officers club, and then being sent to Berlin to be a chauffeur for the State Department. So I got back home in January of '46. One thing further, we got a nuts hat sitting back here. She's very proud of that. We pinned it up on her basket.
You know that, Hank?
Should I? Well, one thing further I'd like to say here. All these years after that, I've been wanting to get back to that battlefield where I was wounded. I'd call these tour companies to see if they could do anything about it. Couldn't do anything. Finally found one, and the lady says, well, let me check and see. So I told her I was going to Tulare. She called back a couple of days later and said, the tour, and this was a tour group. We're going to have lunch in Bastogne, which is about 10 miles away. So our good friend Eric Urbain, who wrote the book, Little Unknown Front, I had his email address. And I passed that on to her, and she got in contact with Eric, and they're talking, and finally he said, well, who is it? She says, Sergeant Howell Moore. He didn't say another word, but says, I will meet him in Bastogne. And he took my wife and myself and another one on a 2-hour tour of the battlefields. Some of this is where I got some of the information from him about what I just said earlier. And as I was coming through, I said, here it is. I looked out the field, the farm field, pasture, 3 fences located just exactly where they were, and fences.
Well, I don't know about the lights. I know the hotel was used. Let's just open it up here for a few more minutes. Gentlemen, anything else you'd like to talk to us about your remembrances of that period of time? Lynn.
When I volunteered, which is part of my life, I guess, but when I volunteered for this session, I said I just wanted to say a few words about the worm's eye view of the Battle of the Bulge, because the topic was the Battle of the Bulge. And I went through that, and I just have a few brief observations. I knew nothing about tactical decisions. They never told us why we were going where we were going when we were advancing with the company. They never told us what except your objective is to take this town or something like that, but they never really told us the big picture. Now, we've gotten that today, so I'm not going to even discuss that. But I did want to say, just briefly, what it felt like for me to go through the Battle of the Bulge, and it's very easy. I was cold, and I was scared. And
Amen.
every time I received shell fire, and we were hitting the ground and trying to bury ourselves in the ground, every time that happened to me, I had a discussion with God. I made a deal with God. And my deal was that if he spared me today, just today, I would try to be the best person I could for the rest of my life, which might be only tomorrow. But and I used to say, but I never got an answer. And people said to me, look at you. Look at how old you are. So I thank you.
Yeah, I think on the equipment, I think so many people got frostbite because what they did, they issued us boots where they turned the leather inside out, and because they didn't want the leather to shine, so you didn't shine those boots. So as a consequence, apparently it captured all the snow and everything, and they froze on there, and we got so many people with their frostbite. So the Army isn't always too bright on its supplying equipment that's